The August heat sat on the Nebraska plains like a hand pressed flat against the earth, and Clara Hobbs was on her knees in it, driving a spade into the ground, with the full weight of her 63 years behind every stroke. The grassroots fought back the way they always did out here, dense and tangled and woven together like something that had decided long ago it would not be moved. She cut through them anyway. Block by block, she carved rectangles from the prairie floor, each one roughly the size of a bread loaf, each one heavier than it looked when she lifted it and stacked it on the growing pile beside her. Her hands ached from the handle. Her back had been sending complaints since before breakfast, and she had been ignoring them since before breakfast, which was the only arrangement that had ever worked between her body and her will. Across the road, two men from the Alderman homestead stood near their fence post and watched. They were not working. They were simply watching the way men sometimes watched a thing they could not explain and did not particularly want to ask about. One of them said something to the other. The other one laughed. Clara did not look up. She had been not looking up at people for most of her adult life, and she was very good at it by now. She had learned early that looking up at people who were laughing at you gave them something they had not earned, which was your attention, and she had made a habit of spending her attention more carefully than that. The building she was planning would surround her existing cabin entirely. Not beside it, not attached to one wall of it, but completely around it, with enough space between the new outer walls and the old cabin walls to walk through freely, to store things in, to keep dry through whatever the Nebraska winter decided to become. She had drawn the measurements herself on the back of a flour sack sitting at her kitchen table in early June, with a pencil stub and a tin cup of cold coffee. She had redrawn them twice. The plan was not complicated, but it required more sod than one woman could cut alone, which was why 3 days earlier she had walked to the Grady farm and knocked on the door. Walter and Roy Grady were brothers. Walter was 32, broad through the shoulders, the kind of quiet that came from years of hard outdoor work rather than any natural disposition toward silence. Roy was 28, quicker to speak, better at estimating distances by eye, the kind of man who could look at a stretch of ground and tell you within a few feet how far it ran without pacing it. Their summer had gone badly. The corn they had planted in the lower field had come up sparse after a dry May, and by late July it was clear the harvest would not cover what they owed at the Milburn trading post. When Clara explained what she needed, Walter had listened without interrupting, which she respected. When she explained what she was offering in exchange, 2 acres of the eastern corner of her claim for 3 growing seasons, good soil, well-drained, close to the creek. Roy had looked at his brother. Walter had looked at Clara. Then Walter said they could start Monday. She had not told them why she was building it. She had told them what she needed built, and that had been enough. The why was her own business, and it lived in a place she did not take visitors. The why had a specific shape. It was rectangular, roughly the size of a cigar box made from pine, with a small brass clasp that had gone green around the edges from the years it had spent on the shelf above the bedroom window. Robert had kept it there for as long as they had been on the claim, and it had held every letter she had written to him during the 2 years before they married, back when he was still working a farm in Indiana, and she was still at her parents' house in Minnesota. She had always thought it strange that he kept her letters rather than his own, that he had chosen to preserve the record of her voice rather than his. He had told her once, sitting on the porch in their second summer on the claim, watching the last light go orange over the flat western horizon, that reading her letters was like hearing her think out loud, and that he had never known anyone worth listening to think before her. She had told him that was the most foolish thing she had ever heard. She had meant it as the highest possible compliment, and he had understood that because he understood most things, she said, which was the quality she had loved most about him, and the quality she had missed most in the year since he was gone. She burned the box on the 14th of January. The fire had been dying since midnight. The wood pile outside was not gone, not technically, but 2 days of hard wind had driven snow against it until the logs were buried under 4 feet of packed drift, and what she could reach at the edges was soaked through the bark, wet and gray, the inner wood barely better. She had gone out twice with the lantern. The first time she brought in enough to keep the fire alive until 2 in the morning. The second time she went out at 2 and found the drift had grown another foot while she was sleeping, and what she pulled free hissed in the stove and filled the cabin with smoke instead of heat. Henry had been coughing for 3 days. He was 13 then, thin the way boys that age are thin before they fill out, and the cough had settled into his chest in a way that made Clara watch him when he slept to make sure the rhythm of his breathing stayed regular. Anna was 7 small, even for 7, and she slept with both their blankets pulled over her head and her knees tucked to her chest. Clara sat between the two of them and watched the fire shrink and thought about the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, which was a distance measured not in miles but in degrees, in the temperature the cabin needed to hold, and the temperature it was losing ground toward degree by degree as the stove consumed the last of what she had been able to bring in. She went through the furniture first the way she had been rationing it in her mind for the past week. The broken chair by the wall had already burned 2 nights before. The small stool near the door went next. She had 3 boards she had pulled from the shed floor, and she fed those in slowly one at a time, watching the heat gauge she kept in her head, the one that told her whether the cabin was holding temperature or losing it. By 4 in the morning, the boards were gone and the cold was winning, and the fire was doing the thing a fire does when it knows it is losing, which is burn everything faster and produce less heat as though panic were its own kind of fuel. She looked at the shelf above the window for a long time before she took the box down. She did not open it. She had thought about opening it, thought about reading the letters one more time, but she understood that if she read them, she would not be able to do what she needed to do. So she kept the clasp closed and set the box on top of the stove and held her hand flat against the lid for a few seconds, feeling the wood still cool under her palm, feeling the smoothness of it that came from years of being handled by the same hands in the same way. Then she took her hand away. The pine caught quickly. The brass clasp turned black, and then red, and then disappeared into the heat, and the fire came back strong and clean and lasted until morning. Henry's cough cleared up by the end of the week. The snow melted in March. Clara spent April and all of May sitting with what she had done, which sounds simple but was not, because doing what needs doing and making peace with having done it are 2 entirely different kinds of work, and the second kind has no schedule and cannot be hurried and does not care how practical or necessary the doing was. She thought about the cold all through that spring. Not with fear exactly, but the way you think about a problem that has beaten you once and that you refuse to let beat you again. She walked the perimeter of her claim on a Saturday in early May and stood looking at the woodpile visible again, now that the snow was gone, and she thought about how close the night of the 14th had actually been, and she thought about Henry's cough, and she thought about Anna's knees pulled to her chest under 2 blankets, and something inside her shifted from mourning into calculation, from the kind of thinking that looks backward at what has been lost to the kind that looks forward at what can be done. The wood had been the problem, not the lack of it, not exactly, but the location of it. The woodpile sat on the north side of the cabin 10 feet from the door, which in normal weather meant nothing, and in a blizzard meant the difference between reaching it and not reaching it. And even when you could reach it, you were reaching into snow, pulling out soaked logs that burned wrong and smelled wrong and produced a fraction of the heat that dry wood produced. You were burning more to get less, which meant the pile that looked like enough in October became not enough by February, and not enough in February on the Upper Platte was not an inconvenience. It was a life or death condition that declared itself without warning and progressed faster than you expected. She needed the wood inside. Not inside the cabin, there was no room for that, but inside something. Protected, dry, accessible from the cabin door without stepping into open weather. She needed to remove the weather from the equation entirely to make the act of feeding the fire independent of what the sky was doing outside. Because the sky on the Upper Platte in January did not care about her fire, did not care about Henry's cough, or Anna's blankets, or the pine box with the green brass clasp, or any of the particulars of her situation, and she had spent enough time being at the mercy of that indifference to know she needed to stop being at its mercy. The idea came to her in a form she almost rejected on the spot because of where it came from. She had been 12 years old the summer her father worked for a family named Holt, who ran a farm about 4 miles outside of town in the county where she grew up in Minnesota. The Holts had built their place in a way that struck young Clara as deeply strange, almost embarrassing, the kind of building arrangement you did not point out to company. Their barn and their house were connected, sharing a roof line linked by a covered passage that also functioned as a storage room. In winter, from what the Holt children told her, you could walk from the kitchen to the barn without going outside at all. Their hay stayed dry, Their tools stayed where you left them. Their firewood stacked in the covered passage never saw snow. Clara's father had looked at that arrangement the way men sometimes looked at things they could not find fault with, but did not want to admit impressed them. He had called it a poor plan for a man who valued his dignity. He had said that a house was a house and a barn was a barn, and mixing them up was the kind of thinking that led to other problems he would not enumerate. Clara had grown up accepting his judgment the way children accept the judgments of fathers who speak with certainty and expect agreement, and she had not thought much about the Holt farm for decades. But standing in her May-thawed yard looking at her woodpile, she thought about it now. She thought about how the covered passage had always smelled of dry cedar and machine oil, two smells that meant things were where they were supposed to be and had not been touched by weather. She thought about how Mrs. Holt had never once in all the winters Clara's family had known them mention trouble with firewood, while everyone else in the county talked about it every February like a wound that kept reopening. She thought about her father's voice saying dignity, and she thought about the pine box with the green brass clasp, and she decided that she had already paid whatever dignity cost and was not interested in paying it again. Dignity was something you valued when you had enough of everything else. She did not have enough of everything else. She had 2 grandchildren and a woodpile and a winter coming in 7 months, and what she needed was not dignity. What she needed was a system that worked. By early June, she had the drawings on the flour sack. By the end of June, she had walked every foot of the outer perimeter, marking corners with stakes she drove into the ground with a mallet. By the first week of July, Walter and Roy Grady were cutting sod beside her, and the strange building that the valley would spend the next several months laughing at had begun to take shape from the ground up. The work had a physical logic to it once you understood what sod actually was. Prairie grass did not sit on top of the soil the way field grass did in Tamar places. Out here, the roots went down a foot, sometimes more, threading through the earth so densely that a block of sod held together almost like stone when you cut it cleanly. When you stacked the blocks with the root side down on the first course and the root side up on the second, the roots gradually wove themselves together across the joint, and the wall became stronger over time rather than weaker, the prairie itself knitting the building together from the inside. Walter knew this. He had built a small sod outbuilding 3 years earlier, and he explained it to Clara the first morning, not because she had asked, but because he was the kind of man who explained things he knew when the explanation was useful and kept quiet when it was not. Clara listened and did not mention that she had already read about it in a pamphlet from the agricultural office in Lincoln, that she had read it 3 times and written notes in the margins, in her careful, even hand, that she had been studying the mechanics of sod construction since March, and understood the root structure and the moisture content and the optimal block dimensions, as well as anyone who had not actually built with the material before. There was no reason to say so, and listening cost nothing, and Walter knew things from practice that the pamphlet did not contain. The outer walls were planned at 3 feet thick, thicker than most sod buildings, thicker than anything the Grady brothers had worked with before. Roy raised an eyebrow at the measurements the first morning, the look of a man who thought the materials were being wasted. Clara explained that 3 feet of sod would stop the wind, where 2 feet would only slow it, and that on the upper Platte in a January norther, the difference between stopping the wind and slowing it was not a matter of comfort, but of survival. Roy looked at Walter. Walter was already lifting the next block into place. The work fell into a rhythm over the following weeks. Clara cut blocks at the perimeter and loaded them onto the wooden sled she had built from 2 warp boards and a length of rope. Roy hauled the sled to the wall site. Walter laid the courses, checking the level with a straight plank and correcting with thin wedges of sod where the ground was uneven. Clara hauled when Roy needed to rest, and she laid courses alongside Walter on days when the cutting was ahead of the building. She was 63, and her joints knew every morning exactly how old she was, and on the worst mornings, they were quite specific about it. But she had learned in the years since Robert died that the only way to live alone on a prairie claim was to stop thinking of your body as something that deserved rest and start thinking of it as a tool that required maintenance. She maintained it with food and sleep and occasional doses of willow bark tea, and she asked nothing more of it than the day required, and so far it had not refused. They worked through July. The walls rose. From the road, the structure already looked strange, a thick-walled rectangle rising around the existing cabin, the cabin visible above the new walls when you stood close but hidden from the road as the sod courses climbed higher. Neighbors rode past and slowed. A few stopped and looked at the thing with expressions that suggested they were working through the geometry of it and not arriving at a satisfying conclusion. No one dismounted to ask. The asking would come later. Clara understood in the winter when the answers were visible and the questions could no longer be avoided. Earl Vance stopped twice that month. The first time he sat his horse at the road's edge for a long moment, head tilted slightly to one side, as though a different angle might help him understand what he was looking at, then rode on without a word. The second time he came closer, close enough that Clara could see his face clearly, and she watched him work through the geometry of it, trying to place the structure in a category he recognized and not quite getting there. He had the look of a man whose mental model of how buildings worked was being quietly disturbed and who was not enjoying the sensation. He rode off before she turned back to her work, and she was aware without looking that he rode off faster than he had arrived. August brought the crisis that had been waiting since the project began, the one Clara had known was possible but had pushed to the back of her mind because worrying about it in advance would have accomplished nothing and cost her the concentration she needed for the work that was actually in front of her. It rained for 2 days in the middle of the month, hard-driven rain from the southeast that came in low and flat and soaked everything it reached. The south and east walls held. The north and west walls had been laid later in the season, with blocks that had spent less time drying in the sun before being stacked. And when Clara walked the perimeter on the morning of the second day, she saw hairline cracks spreading through the north face running in the horizontal lines that followed the sod courses. She watched through the morning. By noon, the cracks were wider. By early afternoon, they were wide enough that she could fit her fingers into the largest of them. The north wall came down at 2 in the afternoon. It did not fall all at once. The top 3 courses slid first, peeling away from the face below them in a slow, deliberate movement that lasted about 2 seconds. Then the middle section buckled at a horizontal joint about 4 feet from the ground, the upper portion tipping outward before the joint gave way entirely. Then in the space of about 4 more seconds, it all came apart, the entire north wall, into a long, low mound of broken sod and mud, an embedded root structure that had been 8 feet of wall that morning and was now a pile of wet earth roughly 18 inches high. Clara stood 10 feet away and watched it go. The sound it made was softer than she expected, a heavy, wet slumping sound, almost apologetic, as though the wall understood it had failed at the wrong time and was trying to fail quietly. Walter set his tools down very carefully, the way a man sets down tools when he is controlling something he does not want to express. Roy looked at his brother, then at Clara, then at the mound of collapsed wall, then back at Clara. 3 weeks of work in a pile of wet sod. Roy started to say something and stopped because there was nothing useful to say. Walter was watching Clara. She stood there long enough that the silence acquired weight. The afternoon sun was already drying the surface of the collapsed blocks, which meant the outer layer would harden into the wrong shape if she left it too long, that the material would need to be broken up and restacked before it set. She was aware of this in the functional part of her mind, the part that kept running calculations while the rest of her was feeling what she was feeling, which was something she had no precise word for, a cold recognition that the ground she stood on was not as solid as she had required it to be, a recognition that was not quite despair and not quite fear, but something adjacent to both, something that lived in the space between the effort that had been made and the result that had not come. She went inside at 4 o'clock and told Henry and Anna she had a headache and was going to rest, which was true, in the same way that calling a blizzard a snowstorm was technically accurate, but missed the main point by a considerable distance. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the oilcloth and looked at the wall where the flour sack drawings were pinned. 3 months of planning expressed in pencil lines on a piece of flour sack. And before that, 5 months of thinking, and before that, a winter that had taken the last physical object she had of the man she had spent 38 years building a life beside, and the wall had come down in 4 seconds on a rainy afternoon in August because she had not accounted adequately for the drainage on the north side. Henry heard her through the wall. He was 14 by August, old enough to understand the difference between the quiet of someone sleeping and the quiet of someone sitting with something terrible, and she heard him pause outside the bedroom door for a long moment. He did not knock. He was a good boy, which meant he understood when not to offer comfort, understood that some kinds of weight needed to be carried alone before it could be shared, that the presence of a witness sometimes made a burden heavier rather than lighter. He went back to whatever he had been doing. She sat at the table until the light through the window changed from afternoon to evening and the kitchen went gray around her. When it was dark, she lit the lamp and looked at the drawings again for a long time without touching them. The problem with the north wall was not the design. The problem was the drainage. If she cut a shallow channel along the outer base of the north wall to redirect rain runoff away from the foundation, and if she started the new wall with blocks that had dried for a minimum of 4 days before stacking, rather than 2, the same failure would not happen again. These were solvable problems. She had been treating them as evidence of something wrong with the whole plan, when in fact they were just problems. Problems had solutions. That was what made them different from losses. She made 2 small notations on the flour sack drawing with her pencil stub. Then she went to bed. In the morning, she was outside before the sun cleared the horizon, cutting fresh blocks from the east section of the perimeter where the drainage was better. When Walter and Roy arrived an hour later, she was already on her 3rd sled load. Walter looked at the collapsed north wall, looked at the new blocks stacked neatly and drying in the morning sun, looked at Clara and picked up his tools without a word. Roy looked at his brother's back for a moment, then picked up his own. None of them mentioned the wall coming down. It was not the kind of thing that needed to be mentioned between people who were going to continue working together regardless. The new wall would be built correctly, and the old one would be dismantled and rebuilt. And that was the nature of work that mattered enough to do twice. They finished the outer walls in early September. The Grady brothers built the roof frame from the heavy timber Clara had purchased from a lumber dealer in Kearney, 6 main beams hauled out on a borrowed wagon, plus the lighter cross members Walter cut and fitted himself over 3 days of careful work. The roof extended 18 inches beyond the outer sod walls on all 4 sides, which meant rain would clear the base of the walls rather than running down their faces, which was one of the changes Clara had made after the north wall failure. The second change was the drainage channel 18 inches wide, 8 inches deep, running around the entire north and west perimeter where the ground fall was toward the building. Roy dug it in a day and a half. When the first rain came, after the roof was on, the water ran exactly where Clara had calculated it would run away from the foundation down the gentle slope toward the pasture. Roy watched it from the corner of the building and nodded once, not at Clara specifically, just at the general principle of water going where it was supposed to go, which was one of the more satisfying principles available on the prairie. The space between the outer walls and the cabin was 6 feet wide on every side, wide enough to move through without turning sideways, wide enough to stack firewood 4 feet deep against the sod walls and still leave a clear passage for moving back and forth. Clara had planned the width carefully, had measured it against her own arm span and against the span of a loaded armful of firewood, and had given herself extra room because things in practice always required more space than they did in theory, and 6 feet felt like the minimum that would work, and she had built for 8. She started filling the ring with firewood in the 2nd week of September. She had been cutting and splitting all summer from the cottonwood she had hauled in from the creek bottom in the spring, working an hour or 2 each morning before the heat of the day made the axe work brutal, and the stacks were already seasoned dry in the center of each split piece, the bark beginning to check along the grain, the way wood checks when it has given up most of its moisture and settled into what it is going to be. She loaded it into the ring by armful and by sled, stacking it in cords against the sod walls, tight rows with the split face out so air could still move through. By the end of September, the ring was full from the ground to the lower edge of the roof beams. Dozens of stacks, more cord footage than she had ever assembled in one place, and every stick of it sheltered from weather the moment the roof went on. On the 1st of October, Clara stood in the middle of the ring and turned in a slow circle, looking at what she had built. The cabin door was 12 feet away. The firewood was everywhere around her, dry and close reachable without setting foot in open air. The sod walls were 3 feet thick and already settling into their final density, the roots knitting across the joints the way Walter had said they would. Above her, the roof timbers stretched wide and solid, built to hold whatever the winter put on them. She was aware this was a moment that deserved to be felt fully, and she tried to feel it fully, but she found that what she felt was mostly tired and slightly surprised that it had actually worked, which was perhaps the most honest response available to a woman who had spent 5 months being certain it would and privately terrified it would not. Certainty and terror were not opposites. She had learned that in the year since Robert died. You could be certain of a thing and afraid of it at the same time, and the fear did not undermine the certainty, it just kept you honest about the stakes. The doors went on the 15th of October. Henry helped her hang them, heavy plank doors hinged on iron hardware she had ordered from Kearney in August, the hardware arriving 3 weeks later than she had been told it would. The left door dragged slightly in wet weather, where the frame had settled half an inch at the east corner. But they closed and they latched, and when they were closed, the interior of the ring fell quiet in a way that was immediately noticeable. The wind outside was muffled. The temperature was already distinguishable from the air outside. The ring had become something it had not quite been before the doors went on, which was a strange room without walls on all four sides of you, but a room nonetheless defined by the sod walls and the timber, roof and the stacked firewood, and the cabin in the center, a room whose purpose was entirely and specifically to protect the thing that would keep the cabin warm. Henry stood in the ring after they finished hanging the doors and looked at the stacked walls of firewood surrounding him, the cords and cords of dry split wood standing on all four sides from the ground to the roof beams. He was at the age where he did not volunteer his feelings about things, where the expression of emotion required careful management to preserve the dignity he was still working out how to maintain. But he turned to Clara with an expression that was as close to wonder as his 14-year-old dignity would allow, and the words came out quiet and certain. "We won't run out this year." It was not a question. Clara looked at the stacks and then at him. "No," she said, "we won't." It was around this time that Earl Vance made his definitive assessment of what Clara Hobbs had built on the edge of her claim. He had been watching the construction all summer with the expression of a man who has not yet decided how he feels about something, but is leaning toward unfavorable and looking for confirmation. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-October, he rode past the finished structure with his neighbor James Alderman and stopped at the road's edge. The thing looked from outside exactly like what it was intended to look like from outside, which was a large sod outbuilding, a barn-sized structure sitting on the edge of the Hobbs claim with a chimney visible above its roofline. Clara had placed the chimney off-center in the final design, which made the whole arrangement read as utilitarian rather than residential, as a building that served a function rather than housed a person. This was intentional. She did not need the building to announce itself. She needed it to work. Earl looked at it for a long moment. Then he said to Alderman, loud enough that Mabel could hear it when Earl recounted the moment at supper, "Old Hobbs woman built a barn around her cabin, working herself to death all summer for that. Must be going soft in the head." Alderman agreed, or at least did not disagree, which was enough for Earl to consider the matter assessed and settled and move on. Mabel heard this account while setting plates on the table and said nothing. She looked out the window toward the south in the direction of the Hobbs claim, where a thin, straight line of smoke rose from the chimney into the still October air. The smoke was steady and unhurried, the smoke of a fire that had not been rationed or coaxed, a fire that was burning exactly as much as it needed to burn, and no more bum. Mabel watched it for a moment and then said quietly, almost to herself rather than to Earl, "Maybe she knows something we don't." Earl told her that was not a very likely explanation. Mabel put his plate in front of him and did not argue, but she kept thinking about that smoke for the rest of the evening and about the woman who had spent the entire summer building something that everyone who drove past had laughed at, and about the specific quality of smoke that came from a fire that did not need to worry about running out of fuel. She had not seen that quality of smoke from their own chimney in any winter she could remember, and she had a good memory for things that mattered. The first frost came on the 23rd of October, early, by the standards of that valley, hard enough to finish the garden overnight and put a clear film of ice on the water bucket by morning. Clara covered the exposed drainage channels with boards against heaving and checked the roof connections for any movement in the beam joints. Everything held. She brought in an extra armload of wood that evening, stacked it just inside the cabin door, within easy reach of the stove, and cooked supper with Henry and Anna. After supper, Henry read from the book of maps the schoolteacher had sent out with the September mail, pointing out places he intended to see someday, and Anna fell asleep at the table in the middle of a sentence about Kansas with her cheek resting on her folded arm, and Clara carried her to bed and stood for a moment in the doorway of the children's room, listening to both of them breathe, which was something she had done every night since the previous January, and intended to keep doing for as long as she could hear anything at all. Later alone at the table, Clara took out the flour sack drawings and looked at them without making any more notations, just looking. She thought about the north wall coming down in August, and the moment of sitting at this same table in the dark afterward, with her hands flat on the oilcloth and the two small pencil notations she had made before going to bed. She thought about the box with the brass clasp. She thought about her father's voice about the Holt farm, about the covered passage that smelled of dry cedar, about the enormous distance between the 12-year-old girl who had accepted her father's judgment without question and the 63-year-old woman who had finally decided he was wrong, and about all the years between those two people and what they had contained. She thought about what winter had taught her, which was not what people thought it taught you. They thought it taught endurance. It did not teach endurance. It taught you the specific location of your weaknesses one by one, with the particular patience of something that had all the time in the world and knew you did not. You either found your weaknesses before the winter did, or the winter found them for you, and the winter was not gentle in the finding. She had spent the first winter finding hers. She had spent the following spring and summer fixing them. Whether she had fixed enough of them was still in October a question with no answer. The answer would come from the north, as answers out here always did, with the wind behind it and the temperature dropping fast sometime between November and March, and it would not ask whether she was ready. She put the drawings back under the oilcloth and went to bed. Outside, the prairie lay flat and dry under the October stars stretching north toward the territory where the real cold came from, the cold that in a few weeks would start moving south along the face of the land, indifferent and enormous and completely without interest in what any particular woman had built or planned or hoped. The wood inside the ring sat dry and stacked. The sod walls sat 3 feet thick. The roof sat heavy and level over all of it. The season had not yet decided anything, but Clara Hobbs had decided something, and in this country, in this particular contest, that was where everything started. The first snow came on a Thursday, which Clara knew because she had been marking days in the small ledger she kept on the shelf above the stove, a habit she had started the winter. Robert died when the isolation had made the weeks blur together until she could not remember how long she had been alone with the cold. Marking days was not sentimentality. It was about keeping a fixed point in the mind when everything outside was moving and white and without landmark, about maintaining a thread of ordinary sequence when the weather was doing everything it could to make sequence feel irrelevant. The snow came quietly, the way the first snow of the season usually did out here, without the wind that would define everything that came after it. 3 inches by nightfall, 4 by morning, the kind of accumulation that settled onto fence posts and gate crossbars in smooth white caps and made the prairie look gentler than it was. Clara stood at the outer door before breakfast and looked at the floor of the ring. Dry. She walked to the nearest stack of firewood and pressed her palm against the split face, feeling the cool dryness of it, the particular texture of wood that has been protected from weather since September. She pulled a log free and carried it inside and fed it to the stove, and the fire took it immediately, cleanly, without hesitation, the low, consistent roar of dry wood burning exactly as it was supposed to burn. No hissing, no smoke, no struggling, just the fire doing what fire does when you give it what it needs. And Clara stood beside the stove for a moment with her hand on the iron door and let the sound of it settle somewhere in her chest where the wrong version of that sound still lived. The wind arrived on Saturday. It came from the northwest the way it always came out here across open ground, with nothing between it and the upper Platte Valley except a few hundred miles of equally open ground and whatever few trees had managed to establish themselves along the creek bottoms, which were not enough to slow anything. By midday, the wind was moving the top layer of fallen snow in long, horizontal sheets that traveled at eye level and reduced visibility to 50 yards in the open. By late afternoon, the drifts had started building against the south face of every structure in the valley, the familiar geometry of prairie winter expressing itself in white, the wind piling snow against anything vertical until the shape of the obstacle was described in snow on the leeward side. Against the outer walls of Clara's structure, the drifts built to 4 feet along the south face by nightfall of the second day. Inside the ring, the floor remained clear. No drift reached the interior. The roof caught the wind-driven snow and shed it over the eaves, and the overhang directed it away from the base of the outer walls, which was the purpose of the overhang, and the overhang was doing its purpose. Clara walked the interior perimeter that evening with the lantern checking the bases of the sod walls for seepage or frost penetration. She found none. The walls were cold to the touch on the interior surface naturally, but they were dry, and the temperature inside the ring was noticeably warmer than the outside air, not warm enough to sit in without a coat, but warm enough that the wood would never freeze, warm enough that the split faces felt only cool rather than bitter against her bare palm. She noticed something else that evening that she had not fully anticipated, which was the silence. Standing inside the ring with the wind moving against the outer walls, the sound of the storm was present, but muffled, reduced to a low sustained pressure rather than the sharp cutting sound she heard from inside the cabin when wind came directly against the cabin walls. It was the difference between hearing a storm and hearing a storm through two separate walls with 6 feet of stacked firewood between them, and the difference was larger than she had calculated. The outer sod absorbed the wind's force the way deep earth absorbed everything, not resisting it so much as receiving it and converting its energy into nothing. And what remained on the interior side of the wall was the memory of the wind rather than the wind itself. Anna noticed it too, the way children notice things that adults have already categorized and filed away. She had come out to the ring with Clara to help carry in the evening wood, and she stopped in the middle of the passage and tilted her head, listening with the particular attention children pay to things that do not match what they expected. She was 9 years old in November, dark-haired like her father had been, who had been Robert's son, and had died of fever 3 years before Robert died of the machinery, leaving Henry and Anna and a wife who had not survived the following winter, so that Clara's household had reorganized itself around grief and necessity the way prairie households always did, absorbing what remained and building forward from there because there was nowhere else to go. Anna looked up at the roof beams and then at her grandmother. "It sounds like the storm is happening somewhere else." Clara looked at her. "That is exactly what it is," she said. "That is the whole point of it. At the Vance farm a half-mile north, the storm was not happening somewhere else. It was entirely and specifically present. Earl Vance had stacked his winter wood in the same location he had used for 11 years against the east wall of the cabin, under a lean-to roof of boards he rebuilt each autumn. The lean-to kept direct precipitation off the top of the pile and prevented the worst of the ice accumulation. What it did not prevent was wind-driven snow from entering horizontally through the open sides, packing itself between the logs with the thoroughness of something that had found an opening and intended to use it, melting slightly during the brief warmer hours of the day, and then freezing overnight into a matrix of ice that bonded the logs together in clusters and made individual pieces difficult to extract without a pry bar or an axe and patience, and hands that were already losing feeling. By the end of the first week of November, Earl was spending 40 minutes each morning working the pile before he could bring enough wood inside for the day. His right hand had developed a deep ache in the knuckle joints from the cold and from gripping the axe handle, and Mabel had wrapped it each evening with a cloth soaked in warmed linseed oil, which helped somewhat and not enough. The fire was adequate. The cabin was cold in the mornings before the stove recovered cold enough that Mabel cooked breakfast in her coat, but by midday, the temperature inside was manageable, and by evening, something close to comfortable. They were getting through it. But getting through it was requiring significantly more effort than it should have, and Earl was aware of this the way he was aware of most inefficiencies in his operation, with a low-grade irritation that he applied silently to the problem, rather than discussing it, which was Earl's way of dealing with most things that he did not yet know how to fix. Mabel discussed it internally, which was her method. She was 39, practical by disposition and by upbringing, grown up on a farm in Iowa where her mother had run the household with a kind of quiet authority that made everything appear to function without visible effort, where the work was done before anyone noticed it needed doing, and the problems were solved before anyone noticed they existed. Mabel had inherited the instinct for that kind of management and applied it to the Vance household with equal invisibility, which meant that most of what she did was not noticed until it stopped happening. She had been thinking about Clara Hobbs's structure since October, turning the idea of it over in her mind the way you turn a problem over when you are not yet sure whether it is your problem to solve or someone else's. The chimney smoke she had watched from the kitchen window, steady and unhurried through the early November wind. The ring of thick sod walls and what they would mean for the firewood stored inside them. The 12 feet of covered ground between the outer door and the cabin door. She was not an engineer and she was not a builder, but she was a woman who had spent her life paying attention to what worked and what did not. And what did not work was a lean-to with open sides on a prairie, where the wind came from every direction it felt like coming from. The first serious storm arrived in early December. It announced itself the way serious storms on the plains announce themselves, with a specific quality of stillness. The morning before it came, a stillness that experienced settlers read correctly, and newcomers often mistook for a pleasant day. The sky was the color of old pewter by 10 in the morning, a flat uniform gray without depth or variation. By noon, the wind had found its register and committed to it a sustained low note that came from the northwest and did not vary. By 2 in the afternoon, there was no horizon. Snow moved across the valley floor in solid white sheets, not falling so much as traveling, driven horizontal by wind that had crossed the open territory to the north without losing any of its intention or its energy. Earl saw the storm building and spent the first 2 hours before it hit working the woodpile, pulling out as many logs as he could reach and stacking them inside the cabin door in a pile he estimated would last 2 days, maybe 3, if they were careful with the fire. It was the right preparation, and he had done it efficiently, and it was not enough. 2 days was 2 days, and the storm lasted 3. The first day was manageable. The second day, the cabin held temperature with effort, the stove running hot through the afternoon, Mabel feeding it every 2 hours through the night in a rotation she and Earl had established without discussing it. Each of them waking at their appointed time in the dark, feeding the fire, returning to bed, a rhythm of maintenance that kept the cabin livable, but left both of them tired in a way that accumulated through the night rather than diminishing. By the morning of the third day, the indoor pile was exhausted. Earl dressed in everything he owned that could be layered and went outside. The drift against the east wall was 6 feet deep and had consolidated overnight into something close to packed ice at the base, the kind of drift that forms when wind-driven snow settles in layers, and each layer freezes before the next arrives. He could not reach the lean-to from the surface. He dug with the flat coal shovel for 40 minutes and reached the edge of the woodpile where the outer logs were bonded together with ice in the way he had known they would be. He worked one free with the pry bar, driving the bar into the joint between 2 logs and leveraging it up until the bond broke. Then another. Then a third. His hands had lost clear feeling by the time he had enough for the morning. Not a painful numbness, but the approximate numbness that meant the cold had placed itself between his skin and the information his skin was supposed to be sending, so that he could see his hands gripping the bar and could make them perform the necessary motions without being entirely sure what they were feeling. He got back inside and stood over the stove until his hands hurt the way they hurt when feeling came back into them after cold, which was a specific bright pain that ran along the finger bones and was not entirely unwelcome because it confirmed that the hands were still working and had not crossed into the territory where the damage was permanent. Mabel fed the wet logs into the stove one at a time. They hissed as the moisture in the bark hit the heat. They smoked. The chimney filled, and she had to open the draft fully to keep the smoke from backing into the room, which drew cold air through every gap in the cabin construction and reduced the stove's efficiency even as it kept the air breathable. It took an hour and a half to get the cabin back to a temperature where they could remove their outer coats. Earl sat at the table and looked at his hands and said nothing for a long time. Mabel moved around the cabin, performing the morning's tasks, and watched him from the corner of her attention, understanding that he was working through something that needed the space to work itself through. That night, lying in bed with the storm still running its long note against the north wall, Mabel looked at the ceiling and thought about what the interior of Clara's ring would feel like at this moment. Not the storm-battered outside of it, which she had seen from the road, but the inside, the ring of sod and timber and stacked wood, the 12 feet of covered ground between the outer door and the cabin door. She had not been inside it. She had only seen it from a distance and imagined it, and now she imagined it with the specific vividness of someone who had spent a winter learning exactly what was wrong with the arrangement she was living in, and who could now picture in detail what a better arrangement would mean. She imagined walking from the cabin door into the ring and finding the firewood standing dry and stacked every piece of it exactly where it had been placed in September, untouched by snow, unreachable by ice. She imagined lifting a piece without a pry bar. She imagined the weight of dry wood. She lay in the dark listening to Earl breathe and thought about how close they had come today to the fire going out entirely, and she understood that close was not a comfortable distance to be from that outcome, and that she was not willing to spend another winter at that distance if there was an alternative available. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. The valley emerged from it the way it always emerged from serious snow, the familiar shapes of fence lines and building corners replaced by smooth, white approximations of themselves. The landscape simplified by accumulation into something that looked almost peaceful. Earl went out to assess the drift damage and found 3 fence sections down on the north boundary where the weight of accumulated snow had broken the top rails. Mabel went to the window and looked south toward the Hobbs claim and found what she had expected to find and had been looking for, which was a thread of smoke rising from the chimney above the sod structure, straight and steady in the post-storm calm, the smoke of a fire that had burned through 4 days of that storm without interruption, without struggle, without anyone going out in the dark with a pry bar to dig through 6-foot drifts for wet logs. She put on her coat and her heavy boots without saying anything to Earl, who was outside with the fence rails, and she walked the half-mile to Clara's claim, in the ruts of an old wagon track. The storm had mostly obscured, but not entirely erased her boots, breaking through the surface crust with each step in the way that made prairie walking, after deep snow, slow and effortful, and she did not care because the half-mile was worth walking, and she had been meaning to walk it for 2 months. Clara opened the outer door when she heard the latch and stepped back to let Mabel inside without apparent surprise, with the expression of someone who has simply reached the point in her life of being surprised by very few things, who has learned to receive whatever arrives without requiring it to have been expected. Mabel stepped into the ring and stopped. The firewood stood in rows along all 4 walls. The split faces turned outward, each stacked tight and dry and seasoned. No ice on any surface, no bonding between pieces, the wood exactly as it had been in September, with only the spaces where pieces had been taken out for burning showing any change. The floor of the ring was bare packed earth, dry and hard underfoot. The interior temperature registered on Mabel's skin as perhaps 40 degrees cold, but manageable, the kind of cold a coat handled without difficulty. From the cabin door, warm air moved outward into the ring in a gentle current that carried the smell of coffee and wood smoke. Mabel stood there and took in the distance between the outer door and the cabin door, 12 feet of covered, sheltered, weatherproof passage, 12 feet between the worst storm the season had so far produced and the fire that had burned through all of it without faltering. She thought about 40 minutes with a pry bar in 6-foot drifts. She thought about Earl's hands at the table. She thought about the Pratt family up at the north end of the valley, whose youngest child had been sick since November and was not improving, and she understood with sudden clarity what Clara had understood months before building had begun. Clara was watching her from the cabin doorway with a coffee cup in each hand. Mabel looked at her and said, "Can you show me how to read the plans for this?" Clara stepped back into the cabin. Mabel followed. The cabin was warm in the way cabins are warm when the fire has been running steadily through 4 days of storm, without interruption, a deep, settled warmth that had moved into the walls and the floor and the furniture and was radiating back into the air from every surface, the whole cabin holding heat the way a stone holds heat, slowly given and slowly released. Mabel sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and felt the warmth move up through her palms and into her wrists. Clara set the flour sack drawings on the table between them. They were worn along the folds now, the pencil lines slightly faded from being handled and re-examined over 7 months, the 2 notations from August still visible in the margins in Clara's careful hand. Mabel looked at them for a long time. She was not a builder, she said so, and Clara told her she did not need to be a builder. She needed to be someone who could explain the dimensions and the drainage requirement to a man who was a builder, and that was a different skill entirely, and one that Mabel clearly possessed. Mabel looked at the drawings again with that frame in mind and began asking questions, good questions shaped by what she had seen in the ring and what she had understood from standing in it, questions about the roof overhang, measurement, and the minimum wall thickness and the drainage channel depth, and why the drainage channel ran only on the north and west faces rather than all 4. They sat for a moment between questions, and then Mabel said something she had not planned to say, had not known she was going to say until it was already out. "Earl told Alderman you'd lost your sense." She said it without apology and without particular inflection, as a statement of what had been said rather than an endorsement of it, as information rather than confession. Clara looked at her coffee. "Earl was not the only one," she said. Then Mabel said, "What made you decide to do it?" "Not the building part, the deciding part." Clara looked at the flour sack drawings for a moment. Then she told Mabel about the box. She had not told anyone about the box. Not Henry, not the Grady brothers, not the minister who had ridden out in February to check on her during the worst of the previous winter. She told Mabel because Mabel had walked half a mile in snow ruts the morning after a 4-day blizzard to ask a question she already knew part of the answer to, and that kind of effort deserved a real response, not a practical one. She described the night of the 14th of January in the plain language she used for things that had actually happened to her without the decoration that made difficult things easier to hear, but less true. She described looking at the shelf. She described keeping the clasp closed. She described the pine catching and the brass clasp going from black to red to gone. Mabel listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Mabel did not say she was sorry, which Clara appreciated because sorry was the wrong shape for what had happened. It had not been a tragedy. It had been a calculation with a specific cost, and the cost had been paid, and the payment had made this possible. Mabel reached across the table and placed her hand on Clara's hand briefly, and then took it back. Then Clara refilled both cups, and they returned to the drawings, and the rest of the conversation was entirely practical, which was its own kind of comfort, the comfort of being with someone who understood when to move from what had been felt to what needed to be done. January arrived with the purposeful cold that January on the Upper Platte always arrived with, as though the calendar itself had given the temperature permission to stop moderating. The nights dropped to 15 below, then 20 below, then, on the 7th of January, to what Earl Vance's thermometer registered as 32 below, cold enough that the breath of his horses showed as solid white plumes rather than vapor, cold enough that the metal parts of the bridle became painful to handle with bare skin, in under 10 seconds cold enough that walking from the barn back to the cabin in the morning made the inside of your nose feel brittle. On the 12th of January, the Pratt family buried their youngest child. The news came by way of a rider from the north end of the valley, a young man named Cutter, who carried messages between several homesteads. When the weather was passable, who arrived at the Vance door in the early afternoon with his coat stiff with cold and the ice in his beard not yet melting from the warmth of the room. The Pratt boy had been 2 years old. He stood in the center of the cabin floor and said nothing for what Mabel later estimated was close to an hour, during which she moved quietly through the room, performing afternoon tasks that required no conversation and no acknowledgement, because she understood that Earl was working through something that needed silence and space, that the news about the Pratt boy had landed in him somewhere specific and needed time to settle before he could locate it accurately and know what to do with it. At the end of the hour, Earl put on his coat. He walked outside and stood at the east wall of the cabin, looking at the lean-to where his wood supply lived, the top of which was invisible beneath consolidated drift. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about his father's farm in Ohio and his father's lean-to design, which had been adequate for Ohio because Ohio did not produce wind that came from the north across 1,000 miles of open ground with nothing to slow it. He thought about 11 years on the Upper Platte using a design built for different ground and different weather, because it was the design he had been given, and he had not thought to question it. He thought about the Pratt boy who had been 2 years old, and about the wood running out, and about the kitchen table burning piece by piece in an attempt to get the heat back. He walked back inside and told Mabel he was going to Clara Hobbs' place. Mabel did not ask why. She handed him his heavier gloves, the ones with the extra wool lining, without comment. He arrived at Clara's outer door at 4 in the afternoon, the sun already low and amber over the flat western horizon, the temperature dropping fast. He lifted his hand to knock and stood there for a moment with his hand raised because he had just become aware that he did not know exactly what he was going to say, which was unusual for Earl, who was not a man who typically arrived at conversations without a prepared position. He knocked. Clara opened the door and looked at him. He was a tall man, and the door frame framed him well, and he was holding his hat in his hands in front of him, with the posture of someone whose visit carried a specific gravity and who knew it. Clara stepped back. He walked into the ring and stopped. He looked at the firewood with the particular attention of a man who has spent the morning calculating how close his own household has come to the condition the Pratt family reached, and who is now standing in front of the evidence of what a different calculation looks like. He walked slowly along the east wall, trailing his fingers along the edge of a stack. He pressed a split face, dry through to the center. He looked up at the roof, the clean underside of the boards, no ice, no moisture staining. He turned and looked at the cabin door 12 feet away, 12 feet of covered ground between the worst storm the season had produced and the fire that had burned through all of it without a single night of the wood running out. Then he turned back to Clara, who was standing near the outer door, watching him with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting for this conversation and is not in a hurry now that it has arrived. He looked at his hat briefly, then at her. "I told Jim Alderman you'd lost your sense," he said. "Building a barn around your house. Said it didn't make any kind of practical reason." He paused. The ring was quiet around them, the wind outside a muffled presence rather than a sound. "I was wrong," he said. "I wanted to say that directly." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The expression on her face was not the expression of someone accepting an apology and putting it away satisfied. It was something more complicated than that, more tired and more knowing, more interested in the practical than the symbolic. She turned to the nearest firewood stack and pulled out a bundle of 4 split pieces, holding them out to him with both hands. He took them. She moved to the stack along the east wall and began showing him how she had arranged it, which pieces to pull first to maintain the structural integrity of each row, how to read the dryness of the inner grain, by the way the split face caught lamplight, how the drainage channel outside the walls prevented the foundation failures that had cost her the north wall in August. That was the part most people would not think of until the wall showed them why it mattered. She told him which was how she had learned it herself, and learning things that way was more expensive than learning them in advance. Earl listened. He asked one question about the roof beam spacing and the load it could carry in deep accumulated snow, which was a good question. The question of someone who was already calculating how to build something rather than simply trying to understand something. Clara answered it with specifics: the beam dimensions, the center, spacing, the additional corner, support she had added after the north wall failure had shown her where the structural stress concentrated under lateral pressure. He stayed 20 minutes. When he left, he carried the 4 pieces of dry firewood in his hat and something else he did not name, but that Mabel would see in his face when he came through the door, the particular look of a man who has spent a day measuring the distance between where he thought he was and where he actually was, and who has accepted the measurement without protest, which is the only way to accept it that does any good. That night, after Henry and Anna were asleep, Clara sat at the kitchen table and took out a fresh piece of paper and began drawing. Not the same drawings, a simpler version scaled for a family with fewer resources and less time than she had the essential principles reduced to their minimum necessary expression: outer wall ring, space roof, overhang drainage channel. What you needed to keep wood dry and accessible. What you needed to put 2 walls between the cold and the fire. What you could build in a single summer with your two willing hands in a season's worth of balm, and the willingness to think differently about the problem than you had been thinking about it. She drew for 2 hours. Henry had heard the scratch of pencil on paper through the wall before going to sleep, and in the morning he found her at the table with the drawing finished and a cold cup of tea beside it. He looked at the drawing and then at her. "Is that a different one?" he asked. "It's the same idea," she said, "made smaller, so someone else can use it without needing what I had." Henry studied the proportions more carefully than a 14-year-old usually studied a building plan, and then looked at her. "Does Mr. Vance still think you went soft in the head?" Clara picked up the cold tea. "He never thought that," she said. "He just hadn't been cold enough yet to think anything else." Henry looked out the window at the January sky, which was the color and apparent temperature of iron. He looked back at her. "He's cold enough now," he said. Clara set down the tea. "Yes," she said, "he is." She worked through 5 more evenings producing clean copies of the simplified design on proper paper, 6 copies totally, the dimensions clearly marked. The drainage channel specified the roof overhang measurement, written out with a note explaining its purpose and why the purpose mattered. She did this because she understood that the worst of the season had not yet arrived, and that when it did and people came to her afterward, she wanted to be able to hand them something they could take home and act on, rather than just a memory of something they had seen and might misremember in the details that mattered most. She was right that the worst had not yet arrived. The storm that came in the last week of January announced itself with nothing. No pewter sky, no morning stillness, no gradual buildup. It materialized overnight from the northwest, and by the time Clara woke on the morning of its first day, the wind was already at a register she had not heard before in 2 winters, on the claim a register that communicated something beyond severity, something in the frequency of it that the sod walls received and transmitted as vibration through the floor, and up through the boards under her feet into her bones. She fed the stove and went out to the ring to check the firewood. The outer doors held. The interior was undisturbed. She walked the perimeter with the lantern pressing her palm flat against each sod wall in sequence, reading the walls the way she had learned to read them over months of living beside them. The south wall was firm, the east wall was firm, the west wall was firm. She reached the north wall and felt something different, not movement, not yet, but a quality of resistance in the surface that was subtly wrong, a density that suggested the exterior drift had built higher than the drainage channel could manage. She went to the small access door on the north side she had built into the outer wall for exactly this kind of inspection, forced it open against the drift pressure, and looked out. The snow on the north face was consolidated to the height of the eaves. The drainage channel was buried under 5 feet of packed drift. The weight of it was pressing against the lower courses of the north wall with the steady impersonal force of several tons of accumulated snow that had nowhere else to go, and the north wall, the same wall that had come apart in August and been rebuilt more carefully, was beginning to express that pressure inward through a series of fine horizontal cracks beginning about 16 inches from the floor. She stood looking at them with the lantern held close. The cracks were not yet failures. They were the wall's way of communicating that it was being asked to do more than it was currently equipped to do, and that the equipment needed to be provided from the inside before the wall decided to provide relief for itself from the outside. She had learned in August the distance between a warning and a failure, and she had learned that the distance was not fixed, that it depended on how quickly you responded, and that responding at 2 in the morning in a storm that had been building for 12 hours was not ideal, but was what was available. She went back to the cabin and pulled 3 burlap feed sacks from the storage corners and the remaining pile of wood scraps she kept for kindling. She returned to the north wall and began working in the dark with the lantern hanging from a nail she drove into a roof beam. She packed the burlap into the widest cracks, tamping it flat with the handle of a wood mallet, using the wood scraps as backing where the gaps had opened wide enough to require rigid support. The work required sustained crouching near the floor, which her knees registered in considerable detail, and without restraint, impressing her full weight against the packed material to seat it properly against the root structure of the sod blocks. She worked methodically, section by section, starting at the east corner, where the cracking was worst, and moving west, not hurrying, because hurrying produced sloppy work, and sloppy work would fail again. She worked for 3 hours alone. The storm roared against the outer face of the north wall throughout, and occasionally the wall shuddered, a deep, low shudder that moved through the floor and up through her knees and into her chest. And each time it did, she stopped and held the lantern close to the repair and watched for movement in the burlap. Each time it held, she kept working. Henry found her at 5 in the morning when he came out for the morning wood. He stopped in the passage and held his lantern up and looked at her, crouched near the floor with her hands packed with earth and burlap fiber, working the last section of the repair in the low amber light. He did not say anything, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him in the past year, his instinct for when silence was the correct response and when it was the only one that did not make things worse. He set his lantern beside hers and knelt next to her and held the burlap flat while she tamped it, and they finished the repair together in the last hour before dawn, the two of them kneeling side by side in the cold ring while the storm pressed against the outside of the north wall with everything it had and the wall held. When it was done, she sat back against the opposite wall and looked at the patched section. The cracks were sealed. The pressure from outside was unchanged, but the wall was no longer expressing it inward. Whether it would hold through the remaining days of the storm was a question with only one way of being answered, which was to wait and watch and keep the lantern close. Henry sat beside her on the floor. They were both cold and covered in dried sod, and neither was in any particular hurry to stand up. After a while, he said, "Were you scared?" Clara looked at the patched wall. The question deserved a real answer. "Yes," she said. "This scared me." Henry waited. "There was another night," she said, "last January. That scared me more." She did not explain further, and he did not ask because he was 14, and he had learned in the past year that the sentences adults chose not to complete were sometimes the most important ones, the ones that contained the most weight precisely because they were never fully put down. The storm ran its course over the following 3 days. The wind dropped on the morning of the 4th day in the abrupt way prairie storms ended, as though a door had been closed somewhere far to the north, and the silence that followed was the specific silence of a world that had been loud for a long time, a silence with texture and weight, the absence of sound that you could feel pressing against your ears. Clara went out to check the north wall before she made breakfast. The repair had held. The cracking had not advanced. The outer drift was still pressing against the wall, but the inner face was intact, the burlap and wood scraps having done the simple work of buying enough time for the storm to end on its own terms. She pressed her palm flat against the repaired section and felt nothing move. She stood there for a moment and allowed herself to feel the full extent of what she had been carrying since 2 in the morning 4 nights ago, the genuine fear that the wall would fail, that what she had built after everything it had cost her would prove inadequate in the test that mattered. She had lain awake between repair sessions thinking about August and about the north wall going down in the rain and about the notations on the flour sack drawing and about how many times a person was permitted to be wrong before wrong became permanent. The wall had held. She went inside and made breakfast. Within 6 hours of the storm's end, the valley began moving again cautiously. At first, a figure visible on a distant road, a horse in a far field smoke from chimneys that had been struggling, now running stronger, as families rebuilt fires that had suffered through 4 days of the worst the season had produced. Clara watched from the window of the ring while she worked through the morning. By afternoon, she could see activity at the Vance farm Earl in the yard, with a shovel working the east wall drift, with the geometry of movements that meant he was digging out the lean-to, again the same lean-to he had dug out after the December storm, the same design his father had used in Ohio, the design that was not built for this. The first family arrived before she had finished dinner. It was the Hargroves from the south end of the valley, Thomas and his wife Ruth, people Clara knew by name and claim location, in occasional meetings at the trading post. Thomas knocked with his hat in his hand and his wife standing slightly behind him, and when Clara opened the door, he said without preamble that Mabel Vance had told him about the building, and he wanted to understand how it worked. Clara let them in. Ruth Hargrove stopped in the ring and looked at the firewood with an expression that combined practical assessment with recognition, the particular recognition of someone who has just identified the solution to a problem they had been living inside for so long, they had stopped thinking of it as a problem and started thinking of it as just how winter was. Thomas walked the perimeter, slowly running his hand along the sod wall, testing the temperature differential between the wall and the interior air with his palm. He stopped at the northwest corner for a long moment, doing nothing visible, and Clara understood he was calculating what it would cost and how long it would take, and which piece of his current situation he would need to adjust to make it possible. She spread a copy of the drawings on the table and walked them through it. Thomas asked questions about the sod course depth and the beam dimensions. Ruth asked questions about the minimum ring width and the interior temperature during extreme cold. Better questions than Thomas's, the questions of someone who had spent the winter managing the actual fire. Before the Hargroves left, 3 more families arrived within the hour. They came separately from different directions, having apparently made the same decision independently after the same 4 days of the same storm arriving at Clara's door, with the same slightly complicated expression of people who had spent time being wrong about something and were now in the necessary process of becoming right. The Lindell family, the Cutter family whose young son had delivered the news about the Pratt boy. A widow named Bertha Morse, who ran a claim alone 2 miles west and who arrived on foot, examined the drawings for 15 minutes without speaking, wrote 3 notations in her own hand in the margins, in the compact, purposeful handwriting of someone who retained information efficiently, and left carrying her copy with the decisive manner of someone who had already calculated the materials list in her head during the walkover and was not interested in spending more time on information she had already absorbed. Each family received a copy. Each family asked questions shaped by their specific land and their specific building situation. Clara answered each one specifically because the solution was not one size and could not be applied identically to every claim in the valley. It was a principle, and the principle was simple: shelter. The supplies create layers between the cold wind and the living space, keep the firewood where you can reach it without faulting the weather to get to it. Apply the principle to the particulars of your own ground and your own situation, and the rest would follow. Earl Vance arrived in the late afternoon as the light was going amber and flat across the crusted snow. He came alone. Mabel had offered to come with him, and he had told her this was something he needed to do himself, which Mabel had understood correctly as Earl's way of approaching conversations that required him to be accountable for his own words without the support of a witness. He knocked. Clara let him in. He walked the ring for the third time, but this time he walked it with the winter's full evidence accumulated behind him, with the memory of 4 days of that storm from inside a cabin whose firewood was 6 feet under consolidated drift, and the ring looked different with that knowledge in him. The same dry wood, the same 12 feet, the same sod walls, everything identical to his first two visits and transformed by what he now understood it meant. He accepted a copy of the drawings. He looked at them for a long time, his large hands flat on either side of the paper, the cold damage still visible in the reddening of the knuckles. Then he looked at Clara across the table. "You had all of this figured out before the first snow fell," he said. It was not a question. Clara looked at the drawings. "I had the shape of it figured out," she said. "The north wall taught me the rest." Earl looked up. "The wall that failed in August." Clara looked at him steadily. "The wall that failed in August," she said. "The one I rebuilt the next morning." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the drawings. Then he asked the question no one else had asked, the question that went underneath the practical ones, to the place where the real story of the building lived. "Were you afraid," he said, "not of the storm, of the whole thing, of building something that big alone and having it not work?" The ring was quiet around them. Outside, the post-storm silence lay over the valley. Clara put her hands flat on the table. "I was afraid the night before I decided," she said. "After that, I was afraid of different things, smaller things. The wall, the roof in the first hard wind, the north wall cracking at 2 in the morning 4 nights ago." She paused, and when she continued, the words carried the weight of something worked out slowly over a long time. Being afraid of something real tells you where to put your attention. Being afraid of trying just stops you. I could not afford to be stopped. Earl looked at his hands on the table. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had been doing the second kind of fearing when he should have been doing the first, and who had accepted this about himself without self-pity, which was the only way to accept it. He left with his copy of the drawings and 3 pieces of dry firewood Clara pressed on him for the walk home, and she stood in the ring after he left and listened to his boots on the crusted snow, the sound growing quieter with distance until it was gone, and there was only the settling silence of the valley coming back to itself after 4 days of something that had tried very hard to be permanent. She stood there for a while after she could no longer hear him. The ring was still around her, warm in its particular quiet way, the firewood patient and dry on all 4 sides. The north wall showed the repair at the lower courses, burlap fiber, and packed earth visible as a seam in the sod, the record of what had tested the building and what had not broken it. She pressed her palm against it, the way she had pressed it that morning, to confirm the repair had held, and the wall felt exactly as it should, dense and dry, and fixed in its place, the roots of the prairie grass still knitting themselves together across the joints, the way they had been doing since July. The Grady brothers came back in the first week of March separately, but on the same day, which was the kind of coincidence that happened between brothers who had worked together long enough to share instincts. Walter arrived first and said he had heard from Thomas Hargrove that Hargrove was planning to build the following summer and wanted advice on the sod cutting. They sat at the kitchen table, and Clara walked him through the modifications the winter had shown her were necessary: the deeper drainage channel on the north face, the adjustment to the foundation, preparation on the uphill side where the groundfall concentrated moisture, the additional roof overhang she would specify on any future version of the design. Walter listened and made notations in his small, careful handwriting. Roy arrived while they were talking and settled in at the table without ceremony, the way a man settles into a conversation he is already part of, even if he arrived late. She told them about the north wall cracking in the January storm. Walter was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "That was the section where the drainage slope behind the north face was wrong. I noticed it in September before we finished, but we were behind schedule and I didn't go back and correct it." He had been carrying that since September, and she realized the knowledge sitting in him all winter, while he had no way of knowing whether the wall had held or not. She looked at him. "It held," she said, "with the repair." Walter looked at the table. "It held because you were up at 2 in the morning watching for it to fail." Clara refilled his coffee. That's what 2 in the morning is for, she said. By March, the light had changed. Still cold, still below freezing at night, but the angle of the sun had shifted enough that the south face of the sod structure picked up heat in the midday hours, and the interior temperature of the ring rose to 45 degrees on clear afternoons without any source of heat other than the sun on the outer walls. Clara had not calculated this in her original design. It was a consequence of the thermal mass of 3 feet of dense sod combined with a favorable southern orientation, and it meant that the ring was usable as a working space on clear winter afternoons without a fire, which was something she had not anticipated and which Anna had discovered before she had. Anna had been using the ring as a play space since November, and by February she had established a corner with a board laid across 2 log stacks as a work table where she sat on clear afternoons drawing in the copybook the school teacher had sent out with the December mail. Clara found her there one afternoon in early March, sitting at her board table with her coat open because the ring was warm enough for that, drawing the outer building from memory, the thick walls and the wide roof and the cabin chimney visible above the roofline. It was a recognizable drawing, accurate in its proportions, the kind of drawing that a 9-year-old makes when she has been looking at something carefully for a long time and has understood its shape. Clara stood in the passage and looked at it without Anna seeing her. Anna had drawn the door open and a figure standing in the doorway, a woman small in the drawing but upright, facing out toward the open prairie, with her face turned toward whatever was coming. Henry's question came on the first Saturday of March, the kind of clear, cold day that promised spring without delivering it, the sky a hard, bright blue, the snow on the open ground beginning to show the faint crust of daytime melt and nighttime refreeze. That meant the season was considering a change. They were sitting outside for the first time since October, on the south-facing bench Robert had built against the cabin wall in their first summer on the claim, the bench that now sat inside the ring, sheltered from wind by the outer sod wall, and caught the full midday sun in a pocket of warmth that made sitting outside in early March possible in a way it had never been possible before the outer walls went up. Anna was at her board table. Henry was beside Clara on the bench with his book of maps open across his knees, though he was not reading it, only resting his hands on the pages. He closed the book and looked at the ring around them, at the sod walls and the timber roof and the remaining stacks of firewood that had come through the entire winter intact, several cords worth, still waiting patiently against the walls, more than enough until next autumn. Then he looked at Clara and said, "Did Grandpa know you would figure out something like this?" Clara looked out through the open south door at the prairie, which was beginning to show the first vague color of returning grass along the south-facing rises where the snow melted. First the tan of last year's dead grass giving way to the faintest suggestion of green. At the base of the stems, the color so pale it was almost not a color at all, but a quality of light. The creek was audible, just barely, the ice breaking up in the afternoon warmth, with the quiet, irregular cracking of something finding its way back to itself. The first birds were back, 2 of them, moving along the fence line, small and quick, not yet singing. She thought about Robert. She thought about the way he had listened, which had been his primary gift to her over 38 years, the quality that made her feel that what she was thinking was worth thinking, that the problems she was turning over in her mind were worth the turning and the time and the attention. She thought about the shelf above the window and what had sat on it and what had burned, and about the fact that the burning had led to this, to sitting on this bench in March sun, surrounded by walls she had designed and built and repaired and defended through the worst winter the Upper Platte had offered in a decade, with 2 children who had come through it healthy and whole and warm. "He knew I would find something," she said. "He didn't know what it would be." Henry absorbed this. The birds moved along the fence line in the particular purposeful way birds moved when they were looking for something rather than just moving. The creek spoke its quiet language of breaking ice in the distance. Anna's pencil moved across her copybook page. "He would have liked it," Henry said finally. "The building." Clara looked at the sod wall across from her, at the place where the north wall repair was visible as a slightly different texture in the lower course's burlap fiber and packed earth, where the cracking had been sealed, and holding now part of the wall's permanent record of what had tested it and what had not broken it. A record written in the material itself, in the difference between the original wall and the repair, between the first attempt and the corrected version, between what she had known in August and what she had learned by January. "He would have asked 12 questions about the drainage," she said. Henry laughed, one short, genuine sound that had surprised him and that he did not try to take back. And Clara found that she was smiling, which was not the careful, managed expression of grief that had passed as a smile for most of the past 18 months, but the real thing, the kind that came from somewhere true and did not require effort to maintain. The summer brought 4 building projects to the valley that Clara knew of directly. The Hargroves started in June, breaking ground for their outer sod walls on the east side of their cabin. Thomas had made one adjustment to Clara's drawings, adding a second drainage channel along the east face where his land fell differently than hers, which was the correct modification for his specific ground and showed he had understood the principle rather than just copying the form. Walter Grady supervised the wall construction for 2 days and left them to continue on their own. The cutters started in July. Bertha Morse, the widow who had arrived on foot through the post-storm snow and left with her margins annotated, had already finished her outer walls by August and was filling the ring with firewood with a methodical daily schedule that suggested she had been planning this since January and was not going to let anything slow it down. A fifth family, the Dennisons, came to Clara in late July to ask about the design, and she gave them the last of her prepared copies and spent an afternoon walking their property to help assess which wall orientation would best suit their site, where the drainage fell naturally, which direction the worst wind came from on their specific piece of ground. Earl Vance built his own version that summer, simpler than Clara's, scaled for 2 people working part-time, but built correctly from the drainage channel up. He did it without asking for further help, working it out himself over 3 months, with Mabel helping on the heavy sod courses. When it was finished, he rode past Clara's claim one September morning and raised his hand without stopping. And Clara, who was working in the vegetable garden inside the outer ring, where the sod walls created a sheltered microclimate that extended the growing season by 2 weeks on each end, raised her hand back. That was the full extent of the ceremony between them, and it was enough because some things that have been said plainly in rooms where the saying costs something do not need to be said again in September with both parties on their horses. Walter Grady brought her a sack of dried beans from his garden in August, setting it on the outer door threshold without knocking, which was his way of conducting transactions he did not want to make into occasions. Clara found it and brought it inside and understood it for what it was, a man's way of acknowledging that the summer he had spent working for her had turned out to be worth considerably more than the acreage she had given him, and that he was settling an account he felt he owed. She used the beans through the following winter. They were good beans, dried properly, stored well, the kind of beans that kept their flavor through a long, cold season and made a broth that warmed you from the inside rather than just from the surface, which was the only kind of warmth that mattered once January arrived in earnest. The structure stood through all of it and through many winters after. It weathered the drought, years of the early 80s when firewood became scarcer, and Clara's stored supply was the margin between comfort and serious want, when she was grateful in a way she had never been before for the 2 acres she had given the Grady brothers, because the good relationship that trade had built was the reason Walter came to her first when he found a stand of dead cottonwood along the creek bottom and needed help hauling it. It stood through 3 more blizzards comparable to the January storm of '77, and through 2 that were worse storms that the valley talked about for years afterward, and that Clara rode out in the ring with the fire burning steadily and the firewood dry and the north wall repair visible in the lower courses as a reminder of what the building had already survived. The north wall was replastered twice in the following decade and reinforced once along the lower courses where moisture still found its way in during heavy rain years, despite the drainage channel. The roof received new timber in 2 locations where age worked into the woodwork that Henry did himself by the time he was 17, competent with a timber saw and a level in the way that boys become competent with things they have grown up watching done correctly and being allowed to try and being told honestly when they got it wrong. On an afternoon in the 2nd October of the structure's life, Clara sat on the south bench with the doors open to the warm fall light and looked at what she had built. The firewood for the coming winters was stacked and dry around her, the cords tight against the walls, the split faces pale in the slanted afternoon sun. Anna was in school riding to the schoolhouse with the Hargrove children 3 days a week. Henry was in the north field with the Grady brothers doing the last of the fall cultivation, his voice audible in the distance occasionally when the wind was right. The prairie outside the open door lay flat and amber-grassed under the October sky, The creek a dark line in the distance, the whole of it quiet in the way that places exposed to the full force of weather are only quiet when the weather has decided to relent temporarily and let the land breathe. She thought about what the building had cost her, not primarily money or labor, though it had cost both. It had cost her the willingness to be wrong in public, in front of every neighbor who rode past and laughed, and to keep working anyway. It had cost her the willingness to build again after the north wall came down, to make two notations on a flour sack drawing in the dark and go to bed and start again in the morning. It had cost her the willingness to act on a memory that her father had told her was not worth acting on, to decide that her father had been wrong in the specific and particular way that people are sometimes wrong when they mistake dignity for wisdom. It had cost her the pine box with the green brass clasp and 38 years of letters, and the particular smell of the wood that she would never smell again. She thought about what it had given her. Not primarily warmth, though it had given warmth. Not primarily the dry firewood, though the firewood had given her the winter, and the winter had given her everything else. What it had given her was the particular knowledge that comes from having built something that worked after you were told it would not, from having survived the test, and then the second test, and then the worst test the season could construct, and having come through them all with the fire burning, and the children warm, and the building standing. It had given her the knowledge that the ground under her was as solid as she was willing to make it, that the weaknesses the winter found were the weaknesses she had not yet fixed, and that fixing them was always possible if you were willing to be up at 2 in the morning watching for the warning before it became the failure. She could hear the fire through the cabin door, the low familiar sound of dry wood and a properly drafting stove, steady and unhurried. The sound she had learned to read as the sound of her family being safe, the sound that the night of the 14th had taught her to protect at whatever cost was asked. Outside the open south door, the prairie stretched away north toward the territory where the cold would start moving south again in a few weeks, gathering itself as it always did, and as it had always done, and as it would continue to do long after every building in this valley had returned to the earth it was made from. It did not care about the building. It never had. It cared about nothing and was coming regardless. The wood was dry. The walls were 3 feet thick. The fire knew what to do, and so now did she.